going to talk about 40 minutes on the importance of biological records, and it's about how we gather them. So not just from our own survey team, but also from all the different species groups, etc., and then how they're being used. So, Alan, do you want to go to the next slide? I'm just conscious of the time now. Okay, so some very basic facts. Team stability with 7 staff. I mean, we were set up in 2002, and 3 of my team, well, include 2 plus me, have been there since the beginning or just before. We've got 3 that have been there 10 to 15 years, and the latest one nearly 4 years. What is so important about that is knowledge, building up that knowledge so that when somebody rings up about a site, we'll know immediately about that site, what's important about it. So I can't overemphasize the importance of retaining staff, keeping them happy. Also, we've trained around 30 volunteer graduates over that 20 years, and they've all gone on to get jobs in the industry, whether it's with Natural England or the commercial consultancy side. So we're very pleased that people volunteering for us graduates do build up that foundation in terms of knowledge of why sites are important, what makes them important. And of course, with COVID, we haven't had any for about 3 years, and that's really impacted on us in terms of building up some backlog. So we've actually taken on a temp at the moment for a year just to see how things go. The HBIC partnership, we've got 25 funding partners. We've had most of those since day one, so that's 20 years of loyalty, which is brilliant. That's all the district councils, the national parks, the unitaries, Forestry Commission, Environment Agency, and all the utilities, well, most of the utilities, the water companies, but also Forestry Commission as well. I haven't mentioned those. So that stability of funding is really important. And then we also have data exchange agreements with most of our species recording groups in Hampshire, where we regularly exchange data with them. So we get updates of their data and we send them our records. That includes the Hampshire Ornithological Society, the Hampshire Flora Group, the Hampshire Mammal Group, reptiles, the Bat Group, etc. And I'll come on to the species stuff just in a bit. I also wanted to just mention we're accredited record centre, and that's quite important in terms of our reputation. The accreditation involves a lot of documentation and policies, making sure we're working to standards, that data is verified, and that we undertake certain core services. So what I really want to concentrate on is our core service, but I thought it'd be useful to mention that we do one-off projects. Most years we'll be doing something. The Basingstoke Canal Survey and assessment, we do that every 5 years, and that's 30 odd miles of canal that has to be walked and sampled to assess its condition and helps advise on management. The Hampshire Ecological Network map I will talk about in a bit, and then we've mentioned our full review of our SYNC criteria after 25 years, and I'll just briefly mention the criteria in a bit. And then there's a couple of other projects we've been doing. So we have a core service, and then where we've got a bit of capacity, and we can take on other projects. The next slide, please, Eleanor.
Sorry, gone too far.
That's all right. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we do in-house before I really start concentrating on the biological recording side. But we've been fortunate in Hampshire that even before HBIC was set up, we've been having a survey team. This is when I joined the Hampshire County Council for literally 40 years now of continuous survey. Our county planning officer once asked me years ago, have you not finished surveying Hampshire yet? And I said, no, it'll never be finished because it's such a dynamic environment. Things change all the time. So you can see from that, we survey about 300 sites a year. And we're now at the point where some sites, particularly sinks, where we're sink monitoring, and you'll see that's quite a large part of that pie chart. We're surveying sinks at least once every 5 to 10 years. And unfortunately, as you'll see from another slide, they are going downhill. There's no question about it in terms of the management. We keep hoping that trend will be reversed with the agri-environment schemes. We also survey, we do a lot of initial surveys to establish interest where we get onto new land. Sometimes that can come about through surveying local plan allocation sites where districts are they're thinking about where they can put new houses or commercial development. So that in itself brings out new data for new sites. So there's a little bit of overlap with all this. So where we survey sites for some of our funding partners to inform management, conservation management, they may in fact be sinks as well. So the sink monitoring is probably a bit bigger than that pie chart would suggest. But those are all the different reasons that we survey sites, and it's always at the request of our funding partners. They give us a load of sites they want us to survey, and then we fill in the rest of the time with sink monitoring. So we work through a program monitoring sinks. Sinks being that non-statutory designation that we've been doing since the mid-90s. So that's just a few bits of graph there about the number of sites we survey. So next slide, please. So this is a really key part of our work, and this is where all that data, not just from our own surveys, but from all the species groups comes in, because all these sites shown in red are our sinks, covering 9.3% of Hampshire. I think we're just past 4,124 at the moment. I think we probably get about 30 new sinks a year now. So it's obviously tailed off from that initial audit of all sites. And you can see the SSIs, the nationally designated sites, covering 13% of Hampshire. So already we're at over 20% of Hampshire is covered by priority habitats and species, designated for being important at the county or the national level. I don't know if you've heard about the government trying to set targets, while internationally there's the Biodiversity Convention about to happen soon, and it's this 30 by 30 is the target. We're not quite sure what the 30 is, but what we'd like to do is aim to reach 30% by 2030 in terms of sites that are designated for wildlife. So we've got a little way to go yet, but fingers crossed we'll get there. Next slide, please. I just thought I'd show you a map of just sinks in the Alton area. An awful lot of the sinks in Hampshire are ancient semi-natural woodlands. That is our biggest sort of resource we have. Hampshire's a very well-wooded county. We're still noticing, areas being cleared all the time, nibbled away, little bits and pieces are going, and we're just in the process of mapping the cleared areas going back to the 1920s. Because I think it's useful to have that information. If you're looking at woodland creation, why not put back the woodland that was there? Because you often find indicators existing along the field boundaries, and you're almost always next to an existing ancient woodland, so that helps with colonisation. So, woodland is one of our greatest assets, but also I think about 20% of all sinks is then non-woodland, so that's your grasslands, your chalk grassland, your meadows, fen pasture, heathland, acid grassland, grazing marsh, so all kinds of wet habitat, and obviously the chalk grasslands, for which Hampshire's well known for. So if anybody ever wants information on any of the sinks, surrounding you, we've got site reports behind everything that's been designated. We'll have all that data at our fingertips. So when you click on a polygon, we call them polygons. When you click on a site, it brings up all this information that we retain on the sink. So when it was designated, what it was designated for, when it was the boundary was last reviewed and amended, etc. So we've got this full history in a database that sits behind what is essentially a map where we digitize all the boundaries. So a lot of information contained within our sinks database. Next slide, please. So what sits behind sinks? Well, back in it was planning guidance back in the mid-90s that said local authorities should look to designate sites of local importance. By that, they sort of meant, because they'd already defined what a priority habitat was. So a priority habitat is something like ancient woodland or unimproved grasslands. So we set about in the mid-90s drawing up our criteria. It was actually on 2 pages of A4, and we've worked with that ever since. But it's based on the guidance from DEFRA, which you can see there. And we've managed with that 2 pages of A4 quite well. We weren't too prescriptive, so you couldn't tie yourself up in knots over what was a sink or not a sink. But then we had so many supporting documents to that sink guidance in terms of the process, and we'd then start attaching, what are the notable species that would meet the criteria for sink, that we decided. And I think we published it in 2021, but I think we started in about 2019. It's about 100 pages long, and it's basically everything that you need in terms of the process and the criteria, the indicator species, the notable species, etc., that you need to designate a site. And we used a consultant, Dr. Phil Wilson, to help us pull that together, because it was a big task, and it did involve consulting with all the species groups. and other ecologists in Hampshire as well. So we're really pleased when that was finally done, and you can find it on our website. And it's something that we will refresh quite often if the wording still is a bit vague or needs clarification and stuff. So that is a bit of a living document now, but there's a lot of wealth of information in there. Next slide, please, Eleanor. So, as I said, the total number of sinks designated stands at just over 4,000. Now, if you look, when we were established in 2002, we already had 3,200 sinks. And that was from previous work before the HBIC days, when we were doing audits for every district council so that they could get them into their local plan policies and on their maps. And so from 2002, we were basically on this continuous path of identifying new sites and reviewing existing sites. So it's you can see it's tailed off. We're not finding as many anymore, but you know, when we do find a new unimproved meadow that nobody knew about before, you know, it's great excitement and stuff that these are still there. So that's where we're stood at the moment in terms of the sink designation. Next slide, please. I think we can probably just pass over this one. The number of, the blue is the number of new sinks, and obviously it's falling down now. If it's just sort of the curves going the other way, we're not designating quite so many as we used to. But in terms of surveying sinks, we survey about 120 a year, which doesn't sound a lot. That should say 5% of all sinks, not 50%. That was a rogue zero. So about 5% of all sinks we carry out in 1 year. So in effect, 20 years to get around all sinks. And the one thing I should stress is we will not survey a sink without a landowner permission. And if a landowner doesn't want to give permission, there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. If he ever wants to contest the sink, then obviously we would need to go in and resurvey it to see if the interest is still there. So, you know, we do get into some sinks that way. And there's occasionally when we've had to delete sinks, and the landowner has actually objected to that. He's like, why are you taking it away? What am I doing wrong, sort of thing. And you know, it's a really positive reaction that we get where they start to look at the management. So I think the next slide is about, if you want to move on to the next slide, Eleanor. Yeah, so we started to keep a tally of the loss and damage to sinks. So, you know, we've lost 94 sinks between 2005 and 2017, which was when I did the last audit. I do need to update it. And you can see the biggest declines are due to lack of management or agricultural improvement. Ones that have been lost to agricultural improvement or lost to lack of management, those are the key things. If you don't manage a site, its interest will decline. And obviously if you improve it with herbicides or fertilizers or whatever, its interest will decline. So the amount lost to development is, you know, there's a few there. I think that's the bottom one, the very bottom blue. There's still a few being lost to development, and we came across one the other day where suddenly there's houses on what we thought was a sink, and we think, how did that get through? You know, there's policies and local plans that say you should not develop on sinks, but you know, sometimes you just seem to get through when we don't get consulted. So that's, but I think we've gained more sinks than lost, so it's still a slightly upward trend. Next slide, please. And of course, all the data that we collect is then what we call translated into a habitat map, and that's the current habitat map. There are 25 different habitat types. As you can see, the green there, the majority of it is woodland. The purple is the heathlands of the New Forest and Northeast Hampshire. Includes things like our chalk streams. Chalk downland goes across the middle. That's, you can barely see it, but it's the brown. It's all very fragmented apart from sites that are within SSIs or nature reserves. So 21% of Hampshire is recorded as priority habitat, which you would suggest exactly matches the amount of designated sites when you combine SSIs and sinks. But actually, only 72% of priority habitat lies within SSIs and sinks, because SSIs and sinks actually include non-priority habitat within their catchment areas. It doesn't all have to be important habitat. It's what makes it a functioning ecosystem. So a lot of our sinks will contain relic chalk grassland within a mosaic of improved grassland. So the steep slopes tend to be the chalk grassland, the tops and the bottoms tend to be improved pasture. So what that does suggest is 28% of priority habitat has yet to be designated, but the reason it's not is we don't have good enough information on it. So, as I said before, a lot of these are small ancient semi-natural woodlands that we've never surveyed. And you can see the total number of habitat shapes mapped. I think it's probably more than that now. This was taken a year or two ago. So there's a lot of data to keep on top of. But that data really useful in then looking at any sort of nature recovery network. So this is the core habitat that we want to protect. And then we need to look at what are the opportunities for doing woodland or any other habitat in terms of restoration or recreation. So next slide, please. I think we're going to talk about the species work. No, we just that one is just to show the priority habitat within the Alton area. I thought I'd just put a few slides in just to show you areas around Alton. Again, a lot of woodlands, I've also shown the replanted ancient woodlands in that crosshatch as well, just for completeness. Otherwise you're wondering why isn't that woodland mapped? But we've got some downland there, we've got floodplain grazing marsh, we've got the rivers. Just off to the east, southeast is where we start to hit the heathlands around Borden and Walmer. So just a little snapshot, and you can see the habitats that we've got down in the legend. I think there's should be 20 up there. The habitats that we've got mapped, and that also includes a lot of coastal habitats as well, which obviously wouldn't appear here. Salt marsh and sand dunes, etc. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so now we get onto the species records. So I think I just thought I'd start with what constitutes a biological record for those that possibly don't go out and do much recording. 4 key elements to a record: who, what, where, and when. Without any of that, it's not a record and we can't accept it. So the who is the recorder, the observer. That can then get verified by someone else. So there's usually the person who recorded it and the person who verified it. Often they're the same person. That information is stored against the records in our database, but we do not give that out when we're giving out data. Under our privacy policy, we don't give out the recorder's name. If somebody wants to check the validity of a record, we'll put them back in touch with the species group or have a chat ourselves. The what is the species itself. Obviously, what is it you've seen? Where is it? And I'll talk about the good reference and the resolution in a minute. And when, obviously the date. As precise as you can to the day. Sometimes it's we do get it in a year, and we sort of have to just pick it's usually the 1st of Jan, and then we know that it was seen sometime during that year. But obviously the date is really important to us because it tells us something about the life stage of that species, whether it's breeding, whether it's just flying over or what. So the date is quite important. You can then, depending on what system you're using for recording that species, you can then add on additional information. So you might want to put the site name in, or the habitat it's in, or what stage it's at, if it's in larva stage or it's adult stage or it's a breeding bird, for example. So lots of different information you can put in. But the basics are the who, what, where, and when. I just wanted to talk about precision, because the more precise a record, the more useful it is to us. And what you can see there is a graph of the number of records. So we're up to, well, we're actually over 9 million records now. This is when we were just over 8.5. The light green is the records recorded at 1 kilometre square, which a lot of species groups will do when they're doing their atlases, because really it's what we call square bashing. So that species has been seen in that square, therefore it's a dot on a map for an atlas. And that is useful in itself, and it's certainly very useful at the national level when you're looking at any changes in distribution of a species. So with climate change, species might be spreading out or they might be contracting. So it is useful for that, but for our work, it's not that useful. Unless you can hone in on the species and then it's got a site name. So it's within that 1K square, but the site name is this wood or this meadow or whatever, and that helps us. So what we're really looking for is species records at the 6-figure grid reference, which is 100 metre square, and that's what most of that green is. When you look at the very bottom of that chart, you can see the dark green. That's species that are recorded at 10 metre squared, so that's an 8-figure grid reference. So, for example, 80% of all our great crested newt records are at that 10 metre, so it tells us the exact pond it's in, or if it's in relation to it's hibernating around a pond or whatever. So the greater the precision, the more useful those records are for us, particularly when we're screening planning applications. The purple at the very top is actually what we record at, which is called the biosite. It's the boundary of the site. So it might be a whole woodland. So they're very precise boundaries, and we know the species is in that square somewhere. And if it's a notable species, so it's a Wildlife Countryside Act protected species, we will record those at the 8-figure, the 10-metre square. So ours are a bit of a mixture of the two, but we know the precise boundary of a land parcel that it occurs in. Okay, next slide, please. So the 9 million species records we've got, as you can see from that pie chart, nearly 50% are Lepidoptera. And an awful lot of those are moth records from moth traps. So it does skew our database a bit, and we tend to ignore the moth records unless they're the really notable species, because a moth trap is obviously drawing in species from a wider area, but it does tell you something about the habitats that are around that location. Obviously, we've got very good butterfly records as well, and then the plant records, which is in red. A lot of that data comes from the Hampshire Flora Group. Birds, 18%. The bird records, when you look on a map of Hampshire, people tend to flock to the coast or to the heathlands or to the New Forest. So trying to push the recorders out into the wider countryside, and it is getting better, particularly with things like farmland birds and woodland birds. There is more targeted recording now for those species. And then the remainder are those last few colours at the top. And it's worth emphasising for something like bat records, of which we've got 26,000 now. That's only 4% of the total, but every single bat species is a notable species. So when I do say notable, I mean protected under the Wildlife Countryside Acts, protected under Section 41 of the Natural Environmental, the NERC Act, Natural Environmental and Rural Communities Act. European species, so something like great crested Newton dormice have European importance. So obviously we were quite concerned about the UK withdrawing from the European legislation with nothing else in place, which might happen. We're hoping it won't, but it could spell a reduced protection for those species. The other thing to say actually is 1.8 million, that's 20% of all those 9 million records are notable species, and that's what we tend to concentrate on when we're analysing data for site designations or with screening planning applications. But also interestingly, more than 80% of those are less than 20 years old, which is, the speed at which people are gathering data with online recording and stuff is actually quite phenomenal. Which is why in a way we don't worry too much about the commoner species. People that are recording lots and lots of, I don't know, robins or great tits or whatever, or blue tits, we don't need to know about those. It's the notables that we are concentrating on. And I should also add that notables also includes those that may not have a current protection, but they've declined by X percentage, I can't remember percentages, over the last 10 years or so. When something's declining, you want to raise awareness of it before it needs protection. So for example, I think swifts, I'll show you something on swifts in a minute. Swifts I don't think have yet got protection, or they're about to get protection. The thing is that the government, the JNCC, which are the umbrella body over Natural England, only review these lists every 5 years, and a lot can happen in 5 years in terms of species decline. So, Hampshire, we've pretty much lost all our nightingales now, but I don't think it's I think it's now on the red list, but it's not a priority species under the Section 41 of the NERC Act. So, it is, the last 10, 20 years have just seen this awful decline in some of our rarer species. But anyway, that's what our database is made up of, and it's that data, this 1.8 million notable species records, that we use. We have it on our mapping for when we, for example, screen planning applications to see what impact a planning application. It might be a household or development, it might be 50 houses, it might be 1,000 houses. We can just set all that out in terms of designated sites, notable species, and priority habitats that might be impacted by a development, and all that goes off to the local authority, so they've got it all to hand. Next slide, please. So species records in the Alton area. This is just to show what's interesting about this. Actually, you can see the blue squares. I've made them slightly transparent. They're all squares that contain species recorded at that 1K level, but within each 1K level, you've got the the red dots, those are the species recorded at 100 metres. So those are the most useful. And then you've got some completely blank squares. Some of them have got 100 metres in them, so they have got some recording, but you've got a blank square just to the north of Alton. Nobody's ever recorded anything in it. Surely it's got something, you know, and that makes you just want to go out, doesn't it? And just even a you know, if you can find a brown hare or something, just fill that gap in. And I think that's what a lot of the you know, the species groups, when they're producing their atlases, they do target these blank areas. But obviously they are really looking for the notable species. They're not going to be recording every blade of grass or daisy or whatever. But against each dot, again, I've shown on the right of the screen is the information that's held against each dot. So that's the species. I don't think this one shows the recorder because we've got various layers of information that we can use, but it tells you the date it was recorded. So here we've got, I think it's a woodlark, but I can't, it's too small for me, but it tells you where it was recorded. I think that's at 6-figure grid reference, but just to the north of Alton. So an awful lot of information behind each square, whether it's at 1K or it's at 6-figure. So next slide, please. And this is, you know, records for song thrush. You'd think we'd have more records than that for song thrush, which is a notable species. It's a section 41 species. So it just shows, you know, that's just typical coverage for that species. Again, it's quite a hard one to try and protect in terms of its habitat because it's quite widespread and you know, occurs in lots of different places. But just useful having that information available. If you're thinking, you know, we're thinking about biodiversity net gain now, so every planning application has to achieve basically no net loss of biodiversity. But if they can't, then they must somewhere within their development envelope put in something that will increase biodiversity. That might even just be some trees or some hedgerows. If it's a householder, it might be putting up a bat box or swift brick or whatever, but it's about increasing the biodiversity, and that 10% comes from a very complicated metric stroke spreadsheet where everything's allocated units and you put in what you have there and then you've got to find 10% more. It could be something like putting in another pond or whatever. So you know, even for song thrush we can increase the habitat. The next slide, I think, Eleanor, is one that we've just started doing over the last couple of years. There's been a lot of interest in swifts because they've been declining. So we now work with the Swift group, Tim Norris, etc., on mapping not just nest sites, but also screaming parties, because screaming parties, if you know what that is when X number of swifts come screaming past you as they sort of get ready to flock down for the night. So that is, a lot of those are in historic buildings and churches. So that is a new layer that we've now put together with the Swift group, and that will tell you, I think the square I clicked on says 25 low screaming birds, 1 nest, etc. So a bit of information there, and that information we make available as well to all the local authorities. So there can be no excuse anymore for, you know, restoring a church and taking out a swift nest, for example. So just every little bit we can do to help swifts. Next slide, please, Eleanor. Okay, so the other big part of our work is dealing with data requests. And before we were established, when we were sort of running this system from our old database, before HPIC was set up, we were dealing with less than 200 data requests a year. So that's increased fourfold. We're now at over 800 per year. So it carries on going up, which is good, because I think most local authorities now, when they get a planning application in, if the consultant or the ecologist preparing that planning application for doing an ecology report, if he hasn't done a desk-based search with us, then they will send him back to us quite often, because you can imagine we're gathering data from casual observations. We may well have gone out and surveyed a site on a particular day in a year. We won't have captured everything that's there. And the same with a consultant going out. It's one snapshot when they may have visited the site, possibly not even at a good time of year, could have been the winter. They think the site's rubbish. We know from the data that all the local authorities have on their desktops. So all our data, they have it on their systems. They know there's more there. So they'd want the consultant to come back to us and get a full analysis of all the information we hold, and that then helps with the sort of assessment of the information before any decisions made on the planning application. So we deal with a lot of data requests. We do that with just, well, 2 people working a couple of days a week, and what we've done is our systems are now so automated that we can carry on coping with that sort of increase, in the sense that we can produce that information much more efficiently with our databases. Press a button and you'll get a standard search area. It's usually 1 kilometre or 2 kilometres around a development, depending on the size of the development. So I think the next slide, Eleanor, just gives some idea of the types of requests we get. So back in 2002, after we'd been established for a while, we were getting just over 400, and 45% of those were to do with proposed developments, consultants doing environmental impact assessments. That's the large blue area. If you look now in 2022, that's it. I haven't got the percentage up, but you can see it's over 75% are now proposed developments. So the bulk of that increase over the years has come from consultancies, which is good because it means they're getting the data up front before they put forward their applications. Perhaps what's not so good is we do still get a lot of requests from what we call community local planning, and that could be anything from neighbourhood plans to local groups wanting to comment on an application, wanting to know what data there is. The grey, conservation land management, this one hasn't really changed. That's really requests coming from organisations that are managing land for wildlife, and a lot of our partners, such as the Wildlife Trust, already have this data, so they won't be coming to us for data requests, but it could be somebody like the National Trust, the Woodland Trust, anybody that sort of owns or manages land for wildlife in Hampshire. What we don't have so much of is agri-environment schemes, which is yellow, and you can see that's extremely, it was more back in 2002, it's less so now. That is landowners putting forward applications for countryside stewardship, and obviously that will roll forward in another couple of years' time into the ELM scheme, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which will replace stewardship. There is, when you go on the DEFRA, the government website, there is all this advice about you really should go to your record centre, find out what you've got on your land, because it might be data they don't know about bird watchers walking the paths, or people walking the footpaths or observing what's going on. They might not know that those species are there. And this is where we really would like Natural England to say to farmers, before you submit your application, do a search with HPIC first, pick up all the information that they've got. It might be that some of it, oh, we don't have that anymore, or that's gone, or we now have this. Well, that's the only way we can build up our data for land that is essentially private, that we can only get on with permission to visit particular sites, but covering that whole gamut of farmland is really important. And of course, in Hampshire, we now have these cluster farms where farmers are working together across landscapes to deliver better biodiversity schemes, and they're collecting a lot of data that is slowly feeding through to us. And it's the sort of thing that, I hate sending data out to somebody and they say, oh, we've got this, you've missed that off, you've missed that off. Well, if you don't send it to us, we can't add it in to increase the whole, you know what I mean? And we have that from consultants as well, who may have surveyed a site. You haven't got my records on, well, you haven't sent them to us, and we cannot go through every consultant's report that sits behind a planning application and harvest all that data from them. We rely on them just sending their records to us on a spreadsheet, or even better, send them to the species groups. Because the way we work in Hampshire is the species groups are the data custodians for their data sets. So HOS owns the bird data. What they do is then they provide us copies of it, and if we spot mistakes or anything, or we've got other records, we send them to them to correct or verify. And so what we're doing is avoiding duplicates of data sets. We all work from one data set, one nice clean data set that basically, so we've got these data flow, sometimes quite complicated, because if you think for things like amphibian and reptiles, you've got the Amphibian and Reptile Trust, you've got 2 amphibian groups in Hampshire, you've got frog life, you've got, I could run out of all the different organisations that we have to connect with to make sure that we're all doing the data flow in the right way, that we're not just building up a whole load of duplicate records. So, for example, when Hampshire Flora Group have a field meeting, you've got 10 people out there all recording. We don't want 10 records of that species. We just want them to send us the one record and say who it was verified by. So it does get quite complicated, the whole data flow, but you know, we try our best to make it as sort of as painless and clean as possible. So next slide, please. Only got a few more, I think. So when we screen planning applications, we get about 12,000 applications in a year. Now we're not going to screen everything from signage to, and I think we don't do any tree work. Because trees are, if you're taking down a tree or whatever, that's counted as a planning application, believe it or not. We expect the person doing that work to assess a site if it's a back roost or whatever. So we're really just doing the household and the commercial and housing requests. But obviously we also do things like road, new roundabouts, roads, etc. as well. And what we're screening against, as I've said, is site designations, presence of priority habitats in the vicinity, and any notable species records. So when we screen an application off a weekly list, off a district council, we then send them a spreadsheet of all the information. And it helps the ecologists there because they can't screen every planning application, just don't have the capacity, but it helps them filter the most important ones to comment on. Next slide, please. So I just thought to put this one up because it's something that we did a couple of years ago where we took all our data. So we took our nationally designated sites, which is in the red. We took our locally designated sites, which is sinks, and also other priority habitat because that has protection in planning, and that's the orange. And then we did some work with the Geodata Institute at Southampton, looking at opportunity. So where would the best soils be, the best, the topography, proximity to existing sites, etc. Where would you want to restore these different habitats to maximize their success? Because what we want to create is a network. We want sites to be either joined up or stepping stones, and it's all about distances species can travel, etc. So that is our current ecological network map. Now, the next couple of years, that's going to change because we're going to use a national model from Natural England called the Nature Recovery Network Model. It will look slightly different to ours. They go more for buffers around sites where we've been quite precise about land parcels. So it's about if you're going to restore, if you're going to create new woodland, you want it adjacent to existing woodland because that helps facilitate recolonization of species, etc. So our network map, our recovery network map, will look a little bit different to this. Not too much because it's going to be based on exactly the same baseline information of where your habitats are, where your designated sites are. But this map is already being used within planning authorities. If you've got a development of say 500 houses and you've got to create some green space, some local wildlife areas, where would you put them within your development to maximize their restoration value or recreation value within an existing network or existing wildlife corridor? So that's where we are at the moment, and this data is all based on data that's been collected by everyone. It's not just habitat data, the species data has gone into this as well, because a lot of those pink areas, the opportunity areas, are where we know there are species records being collected by the species groups that we don't necessarily have enough information to say there's an important site or habitat there, but those species would indicate that there's something there. So they feel like they sort of become a proxy for a habitat that might be there, or the remnants of a habitat that could be restored. I'm getting near the end, so next slide, please. Let's just see what's left. Okay. I'll very quickly go through these just because I did some of these slides to celebrate our 20 years. So I just thought it was useful, the highlights, which I won't go through them. I'll just pick out some key ones. And one of them is increased positivity being shown by landowners. So when our two field ecologists go out and survey sites for landowners, normally you give the landowner the survey report and he just grunts. But now it's like, right, what can I do? What management should I be putting in place? Because they know under the agri-environment schemes, they will be getting funding for doing the right thing. So that's really positive that we're getting more of that. The whole advances in technology just makes our work easier and quicker. With the fact that we're still finding new wildlife rich sites that nobody really knew much about before. And also just to pay tribute to the species groups, they're producing some brilliant atlases, which, I'm using daily to assess the geography or the range, the population of particular species when we're doing assessments. So that's really useful. The one thing I would make a plea to the Hampshire Flora Group is we need a new floral atlas, because I was using one today that's probably nearly as old as I've been there, 30 odd years. So a new atlas for plants would be good. Next slide, which I think is low lights, which I'm not certainly not going to end up on a low, but there are things that they still take us aback. I mean, ash dieback, we sort of never saw that coming, and the amount of trees that are being lost. And we just hope, the resistance that's in those that are left, or the new planting schemes will slowly replace what is a pretty iconic tree on the Hampshire landscape. We had a green-winged orchid, 5 meadows, that we really only discovered back in 2014-15, and the landowner wanted to build on them all, so he sprayed them. And to see green-winged orchids, and there was thousands of them, dying under this layer of herbicide was heartbreaking. Natural England managed to get a stop order on it, but there's a lot of meadows that are just being, surreptitiously sprayed or improved over the years. So over a 10-year period, you can't say when it happened. When did this meadow that had all these plants and indicators back then, and now it's got none, what happened in that intervening time? It slowly got improved. So it's really hard to stop, because there is a law, the Environmental Impact Assessment Agricultural Regulations, that says you cannot improve grasslands that are over 15 years old, and most of these meadows are ancient meadows, but it's something that's really difficult to enforce. And I've been in the magistrates court trying to defend the ploughing of one, and quite frankly the judges didn't know what to make of it, and it got off on a technicality. So yes, ongoing decline, which I think we're all aware of, and a severe decline in many species. So that's something that just it keeps us on our toes. That's why we're here. And then finally, I think one last slide. I think I've run my time. So in terms of what's next, continuing to deliver the core services. There are gaps in our species groups. We're still trying to get to grips with trying to get data off the Hampshire Fungus Recording Group. For example, we've got a 2-year ancient woodland post just started this year. So the ancient woodland inventory that we drew up back in '79 only captured ancient woodlands over 2 hectares. So this is a national initiative. We're capturing all the ancient woodlands below 2 hectares and above 1/4 hectare, and that will add a lot more woodlands to the inventory and give them much stronger protection. I've talked about biodiversity net gain. That's going to become mandatory next year. At the moment, we're just going through this sort of trial period of introducing it. Something which you probably don't need to know, but we're changing our habitat classification system, and that involves an awful lot of work, because how we classify our habitat sits behind every database, and we've got to do a complete shift. And then I mentioned the new nature recovery network map for Hampshire, and behind that will sit a local recovery strategy, which it's been a year now. We're still waiting for the guidance and the secondary legislation on that, but with the shenanigans in government, they still haven't signed any of it off, so we still await that. We're told roll out next spring, next April, so gives us a bit more time to think about how we're going to do a local nature recovery strategy for Hampshire. What we don't want to do is write something that just sits there. It's got to be something that's really deliverable, that's all about restoring nature, and there will be an awful lot of stakeholder involvement and collaboration with lots of different groups, farming groups, forestry groups, local community groups. So you'll all be involved. That's all I can promise at the moment. I think that's my last slide. I thought I'd end up with a picture of north of Alton, which actually took our field ecologist by surprise. He wasn't expecting such a gem of a woodland. It had been surveyed many, many years before, probably back in the 70s, and wasn't that interesting. But the coppicing had been restarted, and it came up with lots of lovely plants, including herb Paris, which probably many of you know is quite a rare species. That's the one in the bottom left-hand corner. So I was going to check to see if it had a footpath. But yeah, absolute gem of woodland. 37 ancient woodland indicators will put it easily in the top 5% of woodlands in Hampshire in terms of its diversity. So that's one for you. I think it's just out on the Odium Road. Yeah. So thank you. I hope I haven't overrun too much.
Yeah, well, thank you Thank you very, very, very much indeed, Nicky, for that amazing survey of your work. I'm just overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all, actually. I had, billions of records, 4,006 sites. I had no idea just how big and complex it all was. We've got, say, 5 minutes for any questions of clarification that anyone would like to ask of Nicky. I'm just going to,
I've got the chat, which I didn't realise actually. I wasn't looking at the chat.
yeah,
but,
no one, I don't think, apart until now, Scott saying it was fascinating,
no.
which is absolutely right, has used it so far, all rapt attention on what you were saying in the slides. So a lot of the information that you talked about, we can access on the website, is that right?
Yeah, if you go to our website, we've got a data request form. There is, for local community groups, there is no charge because we do charge a fee for commercial development requests. Right. So, we're providing, we can provide one-off requests for sites or a particular species in the area, or whatever.
Yeah, there's a huge wealth of data there. Right, there's a question from Gabrielle. Where are you, Gabrielle? Do you want to, the SLP group? Could you tell us what the SLP group is and then ask your question? Where are you?
There I am. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Nicky. Thank you. That's really interesting. The SLP group is the Selborne Landscape Partnership.
Oh, yes.
And I'm one of the farms in that. And I have hay meadows, which I'm restoring as best I can. What I didn't know was anything about you. And Harold from Natural England was very helpful with me. And I think one of the things that's emerging from all our joined upness is that we need more joined upness.
Yes.
I ended up paying for surveys here on the farm with Acadia. And it may be that you already have surveys on my land that would have been really useful to know about anyway.
Yeah, or even just species records collected by species groups that might have wandered over there. I mean, I know Harold very well. From I don't know if he still works for Natural England.
He does, I think.
Yeah, and we know Debbie Miller very well and have helped fund some of their work. So she's in the process of putting together a 5-year report. Excellent. So there is some joined upness between us and the Selborne cluster.
I just think what it is that I didn't know. And
okay, yeah.
So, and it won't be just me. I think it's, and I'm really passionate. I'm in more on the media side with the group, just trying to get up as much linkage as possible between even the parish councils and the farms and everything, so that the corridors just extend into the rest of the area, not just our farms. But I'd be really interested to have someone come here and tell me what more I can do. Okay.
We can certainly help with data and surveys. Arcadia is the Wildlife Trust, isn't it? So I'm sure they'll have done a good survey. Making that data available to cluster farms. We have been doing that an awful lot. What we probably haven't been getting is data back from some of them, which is the annoying bit. Is if people are out recording. So I know, for example, Selborne, there were no harvest mice records in your area, and suddenly everybody went out looking for them, and there were hundreds of records of harvest mice. I'm not sure that data's ever made it to the Hampshire Mammal Group to come back to us. So
it's possible that we didn't have the linkage.
No,
because there are some really avid volunteers who are doing fantastic surveys, and now I've discovered you. I'm sure the rest of the group know about you, but it is important that we get that flow back.
Yeah, if you do have online meetings, I'm happy to turn up to one and just give 5 minutes. But I mean, does Debbie Miller still facilitate that group?
No, but Liz, I think Liz tries on this.
No, she doesn't. It's Matthew Norris-Hill.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Matthew now. Okay.
Yeah. But that you've just given us a lovely case study about why this meeting is so important, actually, and how.
So hopefully we can get better linkage and some more
linkage. Let's just follow up with the 2 questions that have come up in the chat, and then we ought to move on to Cathy.
Yeah.
So there's a question about, does the data only include data sent to you directly, Nicky, or does it include data collected on iRecord, for instance?
Yeah, so the
Data get
iRecord
to
data,
you.
yeah, the data on iRecord is scraped off, or whatever you call it, by certain species groups. They will go into iRecord and they will pull off the Hampshire data and they will verify it, and then that comes to us. But we're not sure all species groups have somebody doing that for Hampshire. So, but sometimes there's some species, some taxonomic groups that don't have a record of Hampshire, but somebody else is verifying it. It might be a national expert. It then goes on to the National Biodiversity Network portal atlas, and we pull it down from that. So there are different ways of getting at the iRecord data, but it is a bit, we've never done a full audit of what's on there, which I think we need to now, because it's becoming more the place to put your records.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Paul has got a question.
Penny,
wants to ask a question.
We've got two people with hands up as well.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll take this question on the ecological network map, the two people with hands, and then we ought to move on to Cathy. Okay. So the question from Paul.
Yeah, Nicky, I know about the ecological network map, and I understand better now how you've constructed that, but it's still very fragmented. And the DEFRA approach seems to be trying to achieve more joined up habitats.
Yeah.
How would you explain that degree of fragmentation in the ecological network map that you produced, and no connectivity?
Well, there is quite a bit of connectivity, but we've also included sites which are best suited according to their geology and their existing land use. So buffers can be quite crude methods. You just put a buffer around, you're not really taking into account the land use in it. What we're going to be doing is moving our data into the Natural England's Nature Recovery Network map, which will look at buffers. And we just accept the fact that within those buffers, landowners can make more choices about what they want to restore or recreate. So I accept the ecological network map is slightly fragmented, but we're still bringing in an extra 11% of Hampshire into a sort of wildlife gain on top of the existing. But it was the best that we've had at the time, and we will be moving to the DEFRA model.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Diana next, and then Amy. Diana.
Yeah. Yes. Hi, Nicky.
Hi.
Yes, I've been working with the Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I've been working with the Selborne Landscape Partnership since 2016 with Debbie Miller initially. Now it's Matthew Norris Hill, and we've had training. I've been mainly surveying for butterflies, barn owls, and wild birds. But I wasn't aware that all this information wasn't being passed to you. I guess that Debbie will be passing on her report to you eventually, and I will jog people's memories and make sure that they pass information on. There was a lady there before who was talking about her farm. I'm working on farmland at the moment, and I've been to Hatchmore Farm in Liss to look at their farm and help them sort out really a better grass lay for their cattle, so that they don't have major problems during periods of drought. Quick question from me, actually. As we know, ecologists will survey sites for developers, but they're contracted by the developer.
Yep.
So in your experience, do they always pass that information on to HBIC, or do they sometimes not pass it to you?
They rarely pass it to us. There are a few good ecologists. They tend to be the sole traders that have already part of the Hampshire network of species recorders, and their data will go straight to the species groups and will come to us. But what we find with a lot of consultancy reports is they're doing vegetation surveys that really are at a much lower level than we would do. What it can do is it can highlight sites for us, and the local authority ecologists will say they've picked, the consultant ecologist has picked out this grassland might be interesting. We'll try and then get in and do a better survey, but quite often we can't. And we were talking about today, because our survey program next year, we've got to backfill. We're going to have to find some extra capacity, and we've got a list of ecological consultancies that we can use within the Hampshire County Council agreement. And I said to our ecologists in the ecology team, which ones of these are any good? And they said, well, this one and this one is, don't use this ones. So, you know, you sort of learn there are some which are, you know, and because they're trying to get biodiversity net gain now, it's actually in their interest to produce better surveys.
Yeah.
Because points win prizes type thing. If you've got some there already, you can just join it up. It's better. But yeah, no, they all vary, and we don't often get those reports. And it's annoying to me that the SIEM website, which is the Chartered Ecologist website, which consultants subscribe to, like I do, it says that we can use their data. Well, we can't, because it's copyrighted. Just because a report appears on a planning portal, we can't just pull their data off. It's intellectual property rights. We'd have to go to them every time and say, can we have permission to take your data? And we just don't have time at the moment.
We find it's only when Tristan or somebody else goes along and surveys that we actually get the correct data.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Fills one with confidence, that response, I must say. Amy, question from you. You've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi. My question is briefly, are you seeing any kind of movement of your protected areas to, like, going further north, is trying to mitigate towards allowing species to migrate further north due to climate change? I know there's lots of studies coming out recently that lots of species are migrating towards the north in order to get out of the heat. And I was wondering, are you seeing that on your maps, or are you planning to maybe kind of say, try and move your protected areas north to accommodate for the obviously influx of different species?
Okay, so just very briefly, we're definitely seeing a spread north for some species. And what the Nature Recovery Network will do is if you like, encourage through habitat recreation species to move outwards, north, or whatever. It's very hard to predict. We've done some studies with the Climate Change Institute, Oxford University, that showed certain butterfly species and the way that they've been expanding. I think the idea is all species need help, and just generally expanding networks out and reconnecting networks is the best way to go. I think Hampshire is, this is happening on more of a national scale than just Hampshire, but that thing of making sites bigger, better, more joined up is the way to go. But we've definitely been looking at it for some species, but it's probably just a bit beyond our remit to. There is a climate vulnerability tool we can build into the Nature Recovery Network, I believe, but I've yet to get to grips with that. I know it's something Natural England have been pushing.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
That's a very interesting and important area. That I'm coming to the conclusion there's probably a discussion lasting 6 or 8 hours that lies behind everything you've been talking about, actually.
Especially climate change.
And the whole of this is such a vast area, very complex. Hardly understand it. But I think we should move on to Cathy now, so that we don't finish too late and have a bit more time for discussion at the end. So Cathy, I'll just introduce you first, and then you two have slides to share. So Cathy Wilson started learning about wildflowers a few years ago to enrich her enjoyment of countryside walks and understanding of different habitats. And she's taken part with other botanists in plant surveys at many sites in Hampshire, and is increasingly involved in local wildlife projects. She's an enthusiastic member of Hampshire Flora Group and Alton Natural History Society, and belongs to the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, Plant Life, and several other nature-based organisations. She's acutely aware that although she's learned a lot, she's still very much on the early rungs of the botanical knowledge ladder. So Cathy, over to you. Lovely to hear from someone who's been on a journey in terms of biological recording over the last few years. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny, and good evening, everybody. Yes, I am very acutely aware of that, and I'm also aware that I've seen names of people who are present this evening who have been on this for many, many years, and I've only been doing it for a few. But I thought I'd just give you, following on from Nicky's very interesting overview, this is coming from somebody who is doing it sort of, as it were, at grassroots level. And just to encourage other people who might be interested in starting to do recording recording, give you a few local examples of things that I'm aware of and say something about why I do it, and a few tips on how you can start if you want to get further into plants particularly and recording generally. So to start with, here's a couple of examples of how recording can tell us about the impact of habitat change on particular species. This is Danish scurvy grass, which despite its common name is a native British flower. It's a salt-loving plant and it's traditionally found on coasts or on cliffs, salt marshes, sand dunes, that sort of thing. And it's a very pretty white flower that produces these cushions in the spring and early summer. If you look at the map of Hampshire, the orange dots represent 1 kilometre squares where Danish scurvy grass has been recorded. And as you can see, in the 1970s and early 80s, there were very few records of this plant in Hampshire. By the 90s, it was clearly spreading inland and not just at the coast. And by 2 decades later, it was much more widespread, with what looks at first sight as being a slightly odd linear distribution. However, you'll see that if I put up a map of the main road network in Hampshire, it follows that almost exactly. So what's happened? It's a salt-loving plant. It's latched onto the lovely salty habitat, which is created by the winter gritting lorries. And it now thrives all along the edges of the dual carriageways and the motorways, painting the lines very beautifully in the spring and early summer with white flowers. So look out for it next year. That was a happy story of spread. This is a rather sadder one, which comes partly from Nor Hill, which many of you will know. This is early gentian. It's a beautiful little thing that grows on chalk grassland, but is very easily drowned out by grasses and other more vigorous plants. It basically needs the chalk to be as bare as it possibly can be of soil. It is only found in the UK, which makes it a pretty special plant in our native flora, and it's declined severely since 1970 due to changes in farming methods. In 1972 at Nor Hill, there were 340 early gentians recorded. By 2009, there were only 2 left, and not a single one has been found since 2009. And this is why. In 2005 to 7, there was a big survey done at Nor Hill of all the plants that were there. And as part of that, Tony Mundell, who is the botanical recorder for North Hampshire, took photos from fixed points of each of the chalk pits at Nor Hill. And in 2020, I retook those photos from exactly the same fixed points using Tony's grid references and on exactly the same day of the year that he'd taken them. So this is Tony's photo from 2007 of the pit, where historically many of the early gentians were growing. And you can see, I think, from the photo that there is a bit of bare chalk on the sides of the pit and on the path, although there's already not very much there. This is my equivalent photo from 2020, and it really shows how much the vegetation has grown since. There's no bare chalk, the grass is much thicker, and the area is almost shrubby in places. So it's hardly surprising that the early gentian, which needs bare chalk, has been squeezed out. And the reason? Well, there was a collapse in the rabbit population, so there's much less grazing there than there was, which has allowed the grass to grow very thickly. The scrub is constantly encroaching despite the best efforts of the Wildlife Trust and its volunteers. And on any wildlife site, there are competing conservation priorities. So that, for example, the needs for particular plant species may have to give way to the needs of an endangered butterfly, for example. And just to show you what I mean by the needs of the bare chalk and how it can make a difference, this is a photograph from Magdalen Hill near Winchester, which has superb areas of bare chalk, and the chalk plants there are absolutely thriving, including many orchid species like chalk fragrant orchid. And it's a really wonderful example of how that can work very well. I know there are hopes to recreate more bare areas at Norhill, but as always, it's a question of thinly stretched time and money to do it. So that was a couple of stories of how records can tell us about the impact of habitat change on individual species. Here's some examples of how they can tell stories about places. The first is Froyle Parish, and I'm acutely conscious that Barry Clark is in the audience. I didn't know he was going to be. He will know far more about this than I do. But just as an example of a sort of long-standing study of a particular geographical area, in 1952, a botanist called C. Langridge wrote an account of the plants found throughout the parish of Froyle. And in 1991, the Alton Natural History Society redid that survey, updating it. And in the last couple of years, that survey has been being done again by Alton Nats. So Froyle now has 70 years worth of the history of wildflowers in its parish, which gives a wonderful account of trends and changing fortunes within a particular small area. That was an example of a long-standing project. Here's a brand new one. Binsted Parish owns about 8 acres of land, which is known as Blackness Fields, which have been let as horse grazing for many years and are now full of coarse grasses and other dominant species. However, these meadows have probably never been ploughed or improved, and they do still contain quite a surprising number of plant species. So with the right management, it should be possible to control the more thuggish species and encourage the more delicate ones, and also hopefully create space in the meadows for seeds that are lying dormant in the ground. Sorry, I've gone on one too far. Right. The site is being run as a really wonderful community project now, and it has got great potential. The meadows have got both damp and dry areas. They sit right next to mature woodland of Alice Holt Forest, and there's a range of habitats capable of supporting many different species. And already in the first year, there's been a huge amount of interesting species of butterflies, moths, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and bats recorded. And again, I'm very conscious Martin Angel is in the audience, who has done all the moth recording there, and he may be able to say more about that if anybody has questions. And recording everything that we can find is a critical part of what we're doing on that site, because if we start with a baseline of what's there, we'll be able to measure the impact of any management changes we make, and that should help us gradually improve the biodiversity. And it will also give us the data to apply to Nicky for formal conservation status as a SINC, which will protect the site, hopefully, from future development. Records also tell you about what thrives where and what's now rare or what's new on the block. So this is Hollybourne Church. In the summer, I was delighted to help at a community event to record plant species here, and some of you will have been involved in that, I know. I hope that will be the first of many such events in years to come, because churchyards can be really important time capsules for plants and wildlife. They were usually formed by enclosing pieces of meadow or grassland long before farming practices changed, which means they may be the last fragment for miles around of largely untouched old vegetation, and therefore have a wide variety of species, some of which are now rare. One of the plants I was quite pleased to find in Hollybourne Churchyard was field madder, which is the pale mauve flower in the centre of that slide. It's not yet uncommon, but it's an agricultural weed to many farmers. And so it's seen big declines in recent decades, and it's rather nice to know that it's there and will stand some chance of surviving there in the long term. It's not all about the countryside, though. Recording in urban areas can show all manner of plants surviving in the most unlikely places. And they can also give the first indications of species jumping into the wild as garden escapes. Alton streets are full of flowers, and all these are growing in the centre of the town, and many, many more. And I couldn't resist including the photograph of the liverwort with its little green parasols, which is growing at the foot of the British Telecom junction box outside the Curtis Museum on the pavement. Next time you go past it, you might want to have a look. In May this year, I spent a couple of hours hunting pavement plants, and I covered only a very few short sections of streets at the Butts end of town and clocked up 116 species, 10 of which had never been recorded in Alton before. So it just shows that one can make a contribution to the record, even in the most unlikely places. And the industrial estates are rich in lovely things. At Omega Park, there are bee orchids, white helleborines. There's, as far as I know, only one, but it is one, broad-leaved helleborine, and many other species, including these lovely pink common centauries. Although I have to say, last time I took my recycling to the recycling centre there, I noticed that that particular bank where many of the bee orchids were growing and a lot of chalk specialist plants has been dug up and planted with some rather boring amenity shrubs. So it'll be interesting to see whether any of it survives. The weld plant at the bottom on the right grows outside the electricity substation on the other main industrial estate, on the bank that is now being managed by Avlan. Thank you very much. And I'm clicking and nothing much is happening. Right, and just to end my examples, I'm returning to dual carriageways. The A31 roundabouts and central reservations near Alton are absolutely stuffed with chalk grassland plants and other special things, if you don't mind taking your life in your hands to get to them. Here we've got yellowwort on the left and swathes of pyramidal orchids. And in the middle is a really quite rare plant called yarrow broomrape, which is a parasitic plant which parasitizes, not surprisingly, yarrow, which grows on the central reservation near the Chawton roundabout and was found there just a few years ago. Before I go on to talking about what I enjoy about doing this, if you want 3 more quick examples, including a very interesting one about amenity grassland on a housing estate in Borden, I strongly recommend. There's a 10-minute video by Tristan Norton, who's an ecologist at Hampshire County Council, about how plant data helps him assess planning applications. And Jenny will be sending out the link for that after this. Okay, so why do I enjoy doing it? Nicky mentioned atlases, and here is one that is about to be issued. Every 20 years, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, which is the main national botanical organisation, publishes data and their analysis of the changing distribution of plants throughout the British Isles, and it includes all sorts of analysis for understanding climate change, which goes back to, I think it was Amy's question, and all sorts of other results about changing in biodiversity. The latest 20-year period was 2000 to 2020, and the results will be published soon. And I get a kick out of feeling that over the last 5 years of that period, I have contributed to the records. So contributing to scientific knowledge is a lovely thing to do. And learning is a huge part of why I do it, because while I'm studying the plants, I'm also learning about the soils they grow in, the underlying rocks, what plants to expect to see in any given landscape, which ones grow alongside which other plants, or wouldn't be seen dead with certain other species. And also about the particular interactions of pollinators and other wildlife with plant species. So I'm learning about ecology generally by concentrating mostly on the plants. I also get to see some quite special places. This is Eelmore Marsh, which is an extraordinarily rich site for plants and wildlife that isn't open to the public. It's part of the old Defence Research Agency site at Farnborough, which is now owned by Kinetic. And I was very privileged to be invited to join this rather select group in the summer, something which would never have happened if I wasn't involved in recording. And also when you're botanizing, you move slowly. notoriously slowly sometimes, and you look very hard at things, which means you see much more. And it's not just plants that you see, but you see much more life generally. And here's a tiny sample of creatures that have crossed my path while I've been out plant hunting, and I'd have missed them entirely probably if I'd just been strolling past on a walk. And knowing about plants doesn't just enrich your enjoyment of the countryside, it also adds all sorts of other things. I find when I'm in an art gallery or looking at a book of prints, I'll start looking more at the picture, the plants in the picture, than at the old master. And you learn about the food and medicine and history of how plants have been used by different cultures. And indeed new potential uses for plants in producing new materials to take over from plastics and the like. They're also everywhere, so you're never bored. You can be hunting them in supermarket car parks, you can be spotting them from traffic jams, you can be standing waiting for a train or a bus, and there's always plants to look at and identify. It gets you out in all weathers, it keeps you fit, and for me it's also very good for my mental health, because when you're totally absorbed in nature, the gremlins in your brain just don't get a look in. You also meet a lot of fascinating, like-minded and enormously generous people. I've found that meeting people who are experts in their field, they have been, without exception, amazingly generous with their time and knowledge. They don't care that you're a beginner who knows absolutely nothing. They simply want to share their enthusiasm and inspire a love for nature in anyone who's interested. And just as a sort of example, here's a photograph of me with June Chatfield, who many of you will know, who's a local expert. And I was out there looking for mosses with her, learning from her and enjoying what was otherwise an extraordinarily dull, drizzly and rather nasty day. And enjoyment is actually the biggest part of it. It's fun, it can be adventurous, you can get into some extraordinary scrapes while you're out recording, falling in ditches or swamps, and it's basically one long treasure hunt, so it's great fun. So that's why it's worth doing. Now for how to start. The first place, if you want to be doing plants, that I would strongly recommend is the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland's webpage on getting started, which is an absolute mine of information and links and tips for beginners. And they also have a good YouTube channel. And as I said, just Jenny is going to be sending out links for all these after tonight's talk. Get yourself a hand lens. ×10 magnification is the best to start with. There's lots on the market. You can get a decent one for not much more than a tenner, and they reveal all sorts of tiny marvels that are very important for identifying plants or indeed other small creatures. There are a vast number of identification books available. These are two of the best and the most frequently recommended. There are also lots of apps. Some of them aren't bad and they are improving all the time, but none of them is yet as reliable as a good identification guide. And if you're into social media, there are some excellent sites that will help you identify plants, and I'm sure this is true for other species groups as well. Wildflower Hour, which is on both Twitter and Facebook on Sunday evenings, is a terrific way to learn from seeing other people's photographs of plants, and also getting your own plant photographs identified if you want help. It's very much the way I got into all of this, so I strongly recommend it. Go along to some field meetings. There is just simply no better way to learn than from being with people who know much more than you do. You pick up all sorts of knowledge that you can't get from books or the internet. Alta Natural History Society runs field meetings on all sorts of topics, not just plants, and Hampshire Flora Group is the place to go if you want to learn about plants. First time I went to a field meeting with Hampshire Flora Group, I was absolutely terrified about how little I knew, and I was put at my ease within minutes by how friendly and helpful people were. If you want to take things a bit further, the Field Studies Council runs absolutely wonderful online courses and longer courses at their centres around the country. And this was a course on coastal plants that I did in South Devon with David Streeter, who wrote one of the books on the previous slides, which was great fun and with lovely people, and I learned a huge amount. And start recording. I mean, as Nicky intimated, iRecord is not universally loved for all sorts of complicated reasons, but it is getting better, and it's a good and relatively easy place to start if you haven't ever done this before. And there is a Field Studies Council online introductory course on how to get going with iRecord. And there's a terrifically good way to do your first recording if you want to get stuck in, which is coming up soon, the New Year Plant Hunt. I haven't got time to explain this in detail, but the website details are coming out to you. And just to say, this is great fun, and you can find some interesting things. This is a common fiddleneck I found on the industrial estate doing it a couple of years ago. It's not the most exciting plant, but it was new to me, and it also is not very often recorded in this county, so that was fun. Anyway, I'm sorry to run on a bit, but I hope you've given you a few ideas about how to start. And if you want to ask me anything more, then feel free to email me. Otherwise, thank you and happy plant hunting.
Thank you very much, Cathy. Brilliant. Thank you. Really inspirational. Perhaps we should organise ourselves in Alton a New Year plant hunt, methinks. Yes, that would be a nice thing for Avlan to perhaps organise in the new year. I will take that away as an action point. We've only got a few minutes really for questions. If we're going to finish reasonably on time, just trying to see if there's thank you, Cathy. Things in the chat. Any questions for Cathy? Well, I mean, as well as plants, we ought to say, there are birds, butterflies, etc. I mean, I'm a member of the British Trust for Ornithology and do my 1 hour garden bird watch each week systematically and submit my data, you know, and I thoroughly enjoy that. And would not notice half the birds that visit the garden if I didn't spend that dedicated hour, you know. So just as a small thing. I will be sending out the links that Cathy mentioned. She's developed this wonderful A4 sheet, which will be coming out. Any questions? Strongly recommend the Natural History Society. Diana, yeah.
I know Cathy by sight because I also work with the Alton Natural History Society, and I'll be in touch with her about surveying a meadow just outside Alton next year. I think we've got orchids and some other interesting plants. I'll be in touch with Cathy.
Lovely, look forward to it.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Cathy's very kindly given us her email address. I hope you don't regret doing this, Cathy, at the end of the page of links that I'll be sending out. Any questions or comments from anybody at all? Am I missing anyone?
Everybody's tired.
I think everybody's tired, exactly. Well, I don't know about you, but I found this really inspirational evening. I've learned so much, touched on so many things. There's so much that we need to follow up on, I think. So we'll come back to all this in Avlan and see what else we can do to support people. If any of you would like to get together to get involved, yeah, because doing things with other people, just get in touch with us, use the Alton Climate Network email and Eleanor will forward it on, and we can arrange a little meetup over a cup of coffee and see what we can do. But I do strongly recommend the Natural History Society, which I joined a few years ago. They're absolutely brilliant. There's lots of different opportunities. We have a vergers program as well in Avlan, where we're letting vergers rewild, and recording what appears, very new program, but so there's lots going on. Okay, I think the messages in the chat are all thank yous. Yes. So Nicky, thank you ever so much for sparing the time with us and introducing us to this huge world of work that you've developed over the last 20, 30 years. It's just awe-inspiring, actually. And to Cathy for making that a reality for us on the ground. Two talks that really fit brilliantly together. So thank you all very, very much. We'll call it to an end now. Everyone's just saying thank you all very much and great evening and so on. So thanks a lot to our speakers. Very grateful to you, and thank you to you all for attending, and hope it's inspired you to do more recording and support nature.